An old veteran stepped in when two starving twins were caught stealing a KitKat. He paid for it and brought them to his empty diner for warm soup. But his kindness didn't end there. When their frail mother collapsed at his door, he carried her inside and even sacrificed his own medicine money to help them find a home. He never knew that this single act of mercy would change his life forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Brendan shuffled down the narrow aisle of Murphy's Corner store, his worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. At 72, every trip to buy his weekly groceries felt like a small victory against time and his failing body. The prescription in his jacket pocket reminded him that his heart medication would have to wait another week. A soft rustling sound caught his attention from the candy aisle. Two small figures crouched near the bottom shelf, their identical blonde heads bent together in whispered conversation. Twin boys, maybe 7 years old, wearing jackets that had seen better seasons and shoes that were a size too big. One of them carefully peeled back the wrapper of a KitKat bar while the other kept watch, his small hands trembling as he glanced toward the front counter. Brendan felt his jaw tighten as he watched the boys break off a piece of chocolate and quickly share it between them. The hunger in their eyes was unmistakable, the kind of desperate hunger that made children do things they knew were wrong. Before he could decide whether to intervene, Murphy's voice exploded across the store like a gunshot. "Hey, what do you think you're doing over there?" Murphy rounded the counter with surprising speed for a man of his size, his face red with anger as he bore down on the two boys. The twins froze like deer caught in headlights, the half-eaten KitKat bar still clutched in one small fist. The boy holding the candy tried to hide it behind his back, but Murphy was already reaching for him. "Stealing candy, huh?" Murphy's large hand clamped down on the boy's thin wrist, jerking him to his feet. "You little thieves think you can just waltz in here and help yourselves." The boy winced as Murphy's grip tightened, tears welling up in his eyes. His twin brother scrambled backward on his hands and knees, pressing himself against the bottom shelf as Murphy towered over them both. The store owner's voice grew louder, angrier. "I'm calling the cops right now. Let them deal with you two brats." Something inside Brendan snapped. Maybe it was the sight of the boy's terrified face, or the way the other twin was shaking like a leaf in a storm, or maybe it was just that Murphy's voice reminded him too much of drill sergeants from a war he'd spent 50 years trying to forget. His feet moved before his brain caught up, carrying him across the store in 4 quick strides. "Let them go." The words came out sharp and hard, with the kind of authority that had once commanded respect in foxholes and firefights. Murphy looked up, startled by the interruption, his grip loosening just enough for the boy to pull his wrist away. "Mind your own business, Brendan. These kids were stealing. I said let them go." Brendan stepped closer, his gray eyes fixed on Murphy's face with an intensity that made the younger man take a step back. "I'll pay for the candy." Murphy's expression shifted from anger to suspicion as he looked between Brendan and the two boys, who were now clinging to each other near the candy rack. "You're gonna pay for them. What are you, their grandfather or something?" Brendan reached into his wallet and pulled out a $5 bill, slapping it down on the nearest shelf with more force than necessary. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from anger or the tremor that had been getting worse lately he couldn't tell. "There's your money. Now back off." The twins watched this exchange with wide eyes, still pressed against each other like two halves of the same frightened whole. The boy who had been caught still held the KitKat wrapper, now crumpled and sticky in his sweaty palm. Murphy looked at the money, then at Brendan's stern face, then back at the money again. "Fine," Murphy muttered, scooping up the $5. "But I don't want to see these kids in here again without their parents. You hear me?" Brendan didn't respond to Murphy. Instead he turned his attention to the boys, his expression softening just a fraction as he took in their thin faces and frightened expressions. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it wasn't directed at them anymore. "Come on," he said quietly, gesturing toward the door. "Both of you, outside." The twins hesitated for a moment, unsure whether this gruff stranger was their savior or just another adult who would lecture them about right and wrong. But something in Brendan's weathered face must have convinced them he meant no harm, because they slowly got to their feet and followed him toward the exit. The bell chimed again as they stepped out into the cool autumn air, and Brendan could feel Murphy's eyes boring into his back through the store window. Once they were on the sidewalk, Away from the harsh fluorescent lights and Murphy's suspicious glare, Brendan stopped and turned to face the boys. "You know stealing can land you in jail, don't you?" The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw both boys flinch. The one who had been holding the candy looked down at his shoes, which Brendan now noticed had holes near the toes. "We weren't trying to steal," the other boy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were just really hungry." Brendan felt something twist in his chest as he looked at their pale faces and the way their clothes hung loose on their small frames. These weren't bad kids making bad choices for the thrill of it. These were desperate children who had run out of other options. He cleared his throat, trying to push down the unexpected surge of emotion that threatened to crack his carefully maintained exterior. "Well, being hungry doesn't make it right," he said, but his voice was gentler now. "But I suppose everyone gets hungry sometimes." The boys nodded solemnly, still clinging to each other as if afraid they might be separated at any moment. Brendan found himself studying their faces, looking for signs of neglect or abuse, but saw only the hollow-cheeked look of children who simply didn't get enough to eat. A dry cough escaped his throat, the kind that had been plaguing him more frequently over the past few months. He covered his mouth with the back of his hand and felt the familiar wheeze in his chest as he tried to catch his breath. The boys watched him with concern, and he waved them off with his free hand. "I'm fine," he said, though they hadn't asked. "Look, you two can't go around taking things that aren't yours, understand? But if you're hungry—" He paused, unsure why he was about to make this offer, but the words came out anyway. "I've got a diner a few blocks down, nothing fancy, but the food's decent and it's warm inside." The twins exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes in the space of a few seconds. Then the boy who had spoken before looked up at Brendan with something that might have been hope. "You'd really give us food?" Brendan nodded, already wondering what had possessed him to get involved in the first place. His diner was barely staying afloat as it was, and he certainly couldn't afford to start giving away free meals to every hungry kid who wandered into his path. But looking at these two, with their matching faces and their shared desperation, he found he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "Come on then," he said gruffly, turning toward the direction of his restaurant. "Let's get you something to eat before you pass out on the sidewalk." As they walked, Brendan could hear the soft shuffle of their oversized shoes on the pavement behind him, and he found himself walking slower than usual to accommodate their shorter legs. His chest was still tight, and his hands still trembled slightly as they hung at his sides, but for the first time in months, the emptiness in his stomach wasn't just from skipping meals to save money. It was something else entirely, something he hadn't felt since the last of his old army buddies had passed away 3 years ago. It was the weight of responsibility for someone other than himself, and despite everything he'd learned about the cost of caring too much, he found he didn't entirely mind the feeling. Brendan's diner sat on the corner of Oak and 3rd Street, its faded red awning and hand-painted sign showing their age like everything else in this forgotten part of town. The boys had eaten their grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup in silence, their eyes darting between Brendan and the door as if they expected someone to burst in and drag them away at any moment. Now they sat in the corner booth, the one with the torn vinyl seat that Brendan kept meaning to fix, sharing a piece of apple pie he'd pulled from the display case. The bell above the door chimed, and Brendan looked up from wiping down the counter to see a woman standing in the doorway. She was thin in a way that spoke of too many missed meals, her brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. The coat she wore was clean but patched in 2 places, and her shoes had been rezzled more than once. Her eyes swept the nearly empty diner until they landed on the 2 boys in the corner, and the relief that washed over her face was so profound that Brendan felt his chest tighten. "Tommy, Billy," she rushed toward them, her voice cracking with emotion as she dropped to her knees beside their booth. "I've been looking everywhere for you. When you didn't come home from school, I thought." She pulled both boys into her arms, holding them so tightly that Brendan could see her hands shaking. The boy named Tommy, the one who had been caught with the KitKat, looked up at his mother with eyes full of guilt. "We're sorry, Mama, we were just so hungry, and there wasn't anything left at home, and we thought maybe if we just took a little bit." "Shh, baby, it's okay." The woman's voice was soft but strained as she smoothed his hair away from his forehead. She looked over at Brendan, who was still standing behind the counter with his dish towel in hand, and her face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, I'm so sorry about what my boys did. They know better than to take things that don't belong to them." I'll pay you back for whatever they ate, I promise. Brendan could see the pride warring with desperation in her expression, the way she held her chin up even as her hands trembled. They didn't take anything from me, he said quietly. I offered them food, and they accepted it. Nothing wrong with that. The woman's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. That's very kind of you, but I can't accept charity. I work 2 jobs. Things have been tight lately. She stood up slowly, one hand on the table to steady herself. Come on, boys, we need to get home. Tommy and Billy slid out of the booth reluctantly, their small hands still sticky from the pie. But as their mother took a step toward the door, her legs seemed to give out beneath her. She swayed sideways, her face going pale as paper, and would have hit the floor if Brendan hadn't moved quickly to catch her elbow. Whoa there. His voice was gentler than it had been all day as he helped her lean against the nearest table. When's the last time you ate something? I'm fine, she whispered, but her breathing was shallow and her skin felt clammy under his touch. Just tired. I work the night shift at the hospital, and then I have to be at the grocery store by 6 in the morning. I just need to sit down for a minute. The boys pressed close to their mother, their faces pinched with worry. Tommy reached up to touch her cheek, his voice small and frightened. Mama, you look really sick. Brendan felt something familiar stir in his chest, the same protective instinct that had gotten him in trouble more times than he could count over the years. He looked at this woman who was clearly running on empty, at these 2 kids who were watching their mother struggle, and made a decision that his practical side knew he'd probably regret. Look, he said, clearing his throat. I've got a storage room upstairs with a space heater. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can rest there tonight, get your strength back. The woman's eyes widened with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. I can't ask you to do that. You don't even know us. You're not asking, I'm offering. Brendan helped her toward the narrow staircase at the back of the diner, the boys following close behind. My name's Brendan, by the way, and you can't take care of those kids if you collapse on the street. As they made their way up the creaky stairs, Brendan could hear voices drifting in from the street outside. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop was talking to someone, her voice carrying that particular tone people used when they wanted to sound concerned but were really just gossiping. I saw him leading those kids in there earlier, she was saying. Now there's some woman with them too. Brendan's always been odd, but harboring homeless people, that's just asking for trouble. Another voice, one Brendan recognized as belonging to Jim Morrison from the hardware store, responded with barely concealed disgust. White trash, the whole lot of them. Mark my words, they'll rob him blind and disappear in the night. The woman in his arms stiffened, and Brendan felt her try to pull away from his support. She turned toward the window, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, and when she spoke her voice carried across the small storage room with surprising strength. Don't you dare call my children that. The words came out quiet but fierce, and she positioned herself between the boys and the window, as if she could shield them from the cruel words with her own body. They are good boys, and they deserve better than your judgment. Brendan watched this display of maternal protection with something approaching awe. Here was a woman who could barely stand on her own 2 feet, who hadn't eaten in who knows how long, but she still had enough fight left in her to defend her children's dignity. It reminded him of something he'd tried hard to forget, a memory of another person who had fought against impossible odds until there was nothing left to fight with. His hands began to shake more noticeably as he thought about Jimmy Rodriguez, his old squad mate who had died in a VA hospital because the insurance wouldn't cover his medication. Jimmy had been proud too, had refused help until it was too late, and Brendan had watched helplessly as his friend wasted away, rather than accept what he called handouts. The woman noticed his trembling hands and the way his breathing had become labored. Are you all right? She asked, her concern for him momentarily overriding her own exhaustion. Brendan nodded quickly, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He busied himself with adjusting the space heater and pulling out some old blankets from a cabinet, anything to avoid looking directly at her face and seeing the same stubborn pride that had cost Jimmy his life. Word traveled fast in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and by the next morning half the neighborhood had heard about Brendan's unexpected house guests. The woman who had introduced herself as Sarah Chen the night before was feeling stronger after a full night's sleep, but the circles under her eyes told the story of someone who had been running on empty for far too long. The boys sat quietly at a corner table, sharing a bowl of oatmeal that Brendan had made from his own breakfast supplies. The morning rush, what little there was of it, brought the usual handful of customers who stopped by for coffee and eggs before heading to work. But Frank Kowalski, who had been coming to the diner every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 8 years, took one look at Sarah and the boys and turned right back around. He paused at the door long enough to catch Brendan's eye and shake his head slowly. "You're not the man I thought you were, Brendan," Frank said, his voice carrying that particular disappointment that came from feeling personally betrayed. "Used to be a place where decent folks could eat in peace." The bell above the door chimed as Frank left, and the sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Sarah's face flushed red and she started to gather the boys closer to her, clearly preparing to leave. But Brendan waved her back down, his jaw set in a hard line as he watched Frank's retreating figure through the window. "Don't mind him," Brendan muttered, but he could feel the familiar tightness building in his chest again. Frank's weekly breakfast order was $12, and over the course of a year that added up to money Brendan couldn't afford to lose. The health inspector arrived just after 10 o'clock, her clipboard in hand and her expression professionally neutral as she surveyed the diner. Melissa Rodriguez had been conducting inspections in this district for 15 years and she'd always been fair but thorough. Today, however, her usual friendly greeting was replaced by a more cautious approach. "Morning, Brendan. I hear you've got some new arrangements here." She glanced toward the back of the diner where Sarah was helping Tommy with his shoelaces. "I need to remind you that residential use of commercial space requires different permits and safety standards." Brendan felt his hands begin to tremble as he poured coffee for another customer, the cup rattling slightly against the saucer. "They're just staying temporarily. No harm in helping folks out. I understand the sentiment, I really do." Melissa's voice was gentle but firm as she made notes on her clipboard. "But if something happens, if there's a fire or an accident, the liability falls on you. The city could shut this place down permanently if we find out you're housing people without proper permits." The weight of her words settled over Brendan like a heavy blanket. The diner was all he had left, the only thing standing between him and complete destitution. His Social Security barely covered his medications, and the small profit from the restaurant was what kept the lights on and food on his table. But when he looked over at Tommy and Billy, who were drawing pictures on napkins with the stub of a pencil Sarah had found in her purse, he couldn't bring himself to care about permits and regulations. Officer Jim Martinez stopped by around noon, ostensibly for his usual coffee and sandwich, but Brendan could tell there was more to the visit. Jim had been walking this beat for 20 years and he'd always been decent to Brendan, even helping him deal with the occasional drunk customer without making a big fuss about it. "Look, Brendan," Jim said quietly, leaning across the counter so the other customers couldn't hear. "I've been getting calls. People are concerned about what's going on here." "Concerned about what?" "Feeding hungry kids. Concerned about safety, about property values, about setting precedents." Jim's voice carried the weariness of a man who had delivered this kind of message before. "I'm not saying they're right, but I am saying you need to watch yourself. This town can turn on people pretty quick when they think someone's causing problems." Brendan's hand tightened around the coffee pot he was holding, his knuckles going white with the effort of keeping his temper in check. "So what are you telling me, Jim? That I should throw a sick woman and 2 little kids out on the street because it makes the neighbors uncomfortable? I'm telling you to be careful. Look after yourself first." Jim dropped his voice even lower, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "There's talk about getting the city council involved, maybe having them take a closer look at your business license. You don't want that kind of attention." After Jim left, Brendan stood behind the counter staring at the lunch crowd that wasn't there. The diner had been struggling for months, but today felt different. Today felt like the beginning of the end. He could feel the weight of the community's disapproval pressing down on him, and for a moment he wondered if Frank Kowalski was right. Maybe he wasn't the man people thought he was. Maybe he was just a foolish old veteran who couldn't mind his own business. The anger built up inside him until he couldn't contain it anymore. He slammed his fist down on the counter with enough force to make the salt and pepper shakers jump, the sharp crack echoing through the empty diner. Sarah looked up from where she was helping Billy sound out words in an old magazine, her face filled with concern and guilt. But then Brendan's eyes fell on the 2 boys curled up together on the bench seat of their booth, sharing the warmth of an old jacket Sarah had draped over them. They looked so small and vulnerable, their thin faces peaceful in sleep for the first time since he'd met them. Tommy's arm was wrapped protectively around his brother and Billy's hand still clutched the crayon he'd been using to color. Brendan felt his anger drain away, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to paternal instinct. These weren't abstract problems or policy decisions. These were real children who needed help, and tomorrow morning, if he sent them away, they would still be homeless and hungry, but they'd be somebody else's problem. If I kick them out tomorrow, he said quietly to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the old refrigerator, where exactly are they supposed to go? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Brendan knew that whatever answer came, it wouldn't be one that let him sleep peacefully at night. He looked around his empty diner, at the cracked vinyl booths and the faded photographs of better times, and realized that losing customers and facing inspections might be a small price to pay for being able to look at himself in the mirror each morning. That evening, after locking up, Sarah sat at the counter with cold coffee, her shoulders shaking as tears finally came. "I lost my job at the hospital yesterday," she whispered. "Budget cuts, and when I couldn't make rent at the motel, they gave us 1 day to get out." Brendan gripped the counter edge until his knuckles went white. "What about family, friends?" Sarah shook her head. "My parents died when the boys were babies. My sister's in California with her own problems. As for friends, people don't want to be around you when you can't afford anything." The silence was heavy with desperation. Winter was coming fast, and those nights would be too cold for anyone to survive on the streets. Without a word, Brendan walked to his small safe behind the water heater. Inside was everything he'd saved over 5 years, $1,500 in crumpled bills set aside $1 at a time. He pulled out his prescription bottle and stared at the label. The heart medication would cost $800 a month. The doctor had been clear, without these pills his irregular heartbeat would eventually stop his heart completely. His chest tightened as if to remind him, and he felt the erratic rhythm that had been getting worse every week. The shortness of breath, the dizziness, the shaking hands, all signs his body was failing just when Sarah and her boys needed him most. When he returned, he placed the envelope on the counter between them. "What's this?" Sarah's voice was cautious. "Enough for a deposit on an apartment. First month's rent too. There's a place on Maple Street above the laundromat." Sarah stared at the envelope. "Brendan, I can't take your money. This is probably everything you have." "It is everything I have. And I'm giving it to you because those boys deserve a chance to grow up somewhere safe." "But what about your medication, your doctor bills?" Brendan set the prescription bottle next to the envelope. "I've lived 72 years without anyone depending on me. Made it through a war, made it through losing everyone I cared about. I think I can manage a little longer." The lie came easily, but the truth was written in his shaking hands and labored breathing. Without those pills he probably had months, not years. "You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it. Don't argue with me, Sarah. Just take the money and give those boys a home." Sarah picked up the envelope with trembling hands, tears falling freely. "How can I ever repay you? You don't repay it, you just live. You make sure those boys grow up safe and happy, and that's payment enough." After they left, Brendan sat alone in his diner with the lights low. When a coughing fit seized him, he tasted copper on his tongue. For the first time in years he was truly alone, but somehow this loneliness felt like a choice rather than a sentence. 3 months passed. Word of Brendan's kindness had somehow spread, and the diner slowly began to fill again. Frank Kowalski returned, sheepishly ordering his usual breakfast. Mrs. Patterson stopped by with flowers and an apology. The community that had once shunned him now saw him as a local hero. But Brendan's health was failing rapidly. His hair had turned completely white, his hands shook constantly, and some mornings he could barely get out of bed. The prescription bottle sat empty on his nightstand, a daily reminder of his choice. On a gray Tuesday morning, identical to the one when he'd first met the boys, Brendan was moving slower than ever. His chest felt tight, and his heart skipped beats like a broken record. He'd spent the night awake, struggling to breathe. The coffee pot seemed impossibly heavy as he tried to start his morning routine. He set it down twice, gasping for breath, when his heart suddenly stuttered and stopped. Brendan collapsed behind the counter, alone in his empty diner. He woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding him. A nurse explained he'd had a massive heart attack. Murphy from the corner store had found him and called 911. "You're lucky to be alive," the doctor said, "but your heart is severely damaged. You'll need constant care and medication. We should have started months ago." Brendan stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his choices. He had no family, no insurance, no way to pay for the care he needed. The diner would have to be sold to cover medical bills. He would die alone in this sterile room, having saved a family but lost everything else. On his fourth day, footsteps approached his bed. He turned to see Sarah, her face filled with concern and determination. Behind her came Tommy and Billy, now healthy and round-cheeked, carrying flowers and drawings. "What are you doing here?" Brendan whispered. "Someone called and told us you were sick," Sarah said, pulling a chair close to his bed. "Did you really think we wouldn't come?" Tommy climbed carefully onto the bed and hugged Brendan's arm. "We're going to take care of you now, Mr. Brendan. Just like you took care of us." "You can't, I don't have insurance, I can't pay for treatment." Sarah smiled through her tears. "I have insurance now, remember? Good insurance from my job at the medical center. And I've been saving money too, putting aside what I can every month. It's not much, but it's a start toward paying you back. But your apartment, your life, our apartment has a spare room. We've been hoping you might need it someday." She squeezed his hand. "You gave us a family when we had nothing. Now we want to give you one too." Billy pulled out a slightly crumpled KitKat bar from his pocket and placed it on the bedside table. "We bought this for you, Mr. Brendan, for when you get better and come home with us." Over the following weeks, as Brendan slowly recovered, the community that had once judged him rallied around him. Pastor Williams organized meals. Mrs. Patterson brought flowers daily. Frank Kowalski visited every Tuesday and Thursday, just like his old diner schedule. But it was Sarah and the boys who never left his side. They moved a cot into his hospital room, taking shifts so he was never alone. Tommy read him stories. Billy drew pictures of their family, always including Brendan in the center. Sarah handled his medical bills and insurance claims with the efficiency of someone who understood the system. When Brendan was finally released, they brought him to their apartment above the laundromat on Maple Street, the same apartment his money had secured. The spare room was already prepared with his few belongings from the diner, which Sarah had carefully collected and arranged. "This is your home now," she said simply. "For as long as you want it." That evening, as they sat around the small kitchen table sharing Chinese takeout, Brendan looked at the faces of his new family. Tommy was explaining a science project while Billy colored in a book. Sarah was laughing at something one of the boys had said, her face bright with contentment. The pocket watch Sarah had given him months ago ticked steadily in his shirt pocket, marking time that no longer felt threatening. His heart medication sat on the kitchen counter next to vitamins for the boys, just another part of their daily routine. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, but inside their little apartment, everything was warm and bright. Brendan reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for what?" "For letting an old man learn what family really means." Tommy looked up from his homework and grinned. "You're not that old, Grandpa Brendan." Grandpa Brendan. The title settled around him like a comfortable coat, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Brendan felt completely at home.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.